Good morning, Morai Rabotai, Bruchim Abayim. We are continuing our Masechet Succah, and we are on Daf Chaf Bet, Amud Aleph, 8 lines up from the bottom of the Amud. Today's Amud is being learned as a schut for Refuah Shlema of Rachel Simcha Bat Nahid, Esther Bracha Bat Chaya, Nisim Ben Miriam, and for all the people who have been affected by the wildfires that we have been experiencing the past week. Our tefillot and the limud should be indeed a zchut for Achenu Bet Yisrael that have been affected by this as well. Also today's limud should be Le'ilui Nishmat, Mrs. Kahan, Javahir, I think Kahan is the name, that just passed away. Should be an aliyah for her neshama. Today is going to be the funeral. For those who need the information, please see me afterwards. This month's learning of the community has been graciously dedicated by the Shea family, Cohen family, and Dayan families. It should be an ultimate zchut for all of their mishpachot, Be'ezrat Hashem, Amen. Okay, so we started a introduction for one of the Halacha Moshe Misinais that we had not seen before. In the past 21 block Gemaras, we were introduced to a lot of the halachot within Shiurin, Chatzitzin, Umechitzin, Halacha Moshe Misinai. We learned all about Dofa Lakuma, the Mechitza of Asara. We learned about Good Achit, Good Asik, and all of the related halachot. And yet, the last shiur we introduced one more of the concepts of the Mechitza, that is Halacha Moshe Misinai, and that is Chabot Rami. What's Chabot Rami? That it basically is another form of Good Achit. Good Achit says that if you have a Mechitza that's hovering, it's on the air, you could, and it's standing vertically, you could get the edge and extend it downward. So if you have a Mechitza standing here, the bottom of it we could extend down, an imaginary Mechitza that is extended downward. That's Good Achit. Now, Chavot Rami is the same concept, but not with a vertically standing Mechitza, but rather a horizontally standing Mechitza, that we could imagine that this whole Mechitza, instead of being here, it is lower down where we need it to be. Now that's Chavot Rami, and Rava wanted to prove from a concept in Mishnah in Masechet Ohalot in Perek Yud Bet, that in order for us to say Chavot Rami, we would need to have at least a width of 1 tefach. This has to be at least 1 tefach for us to be able to say Chavot Rami, lower the Mechitza and apply it where we need it. Now, what was the concept in the Mishnah in Masechet Ohalot? We all know that if you have a ceiling, a solid ceiling like this room, if you have a kazayit of a dead body, corpse, any corner, anywhere under the ceiling, the entire cavity of the room is going to be tameh tumat ohel. You could be hundreds of feet away from the corpse, and you will become tameh because of tumat ohel. Right? Now that's only if you have a solid ceiling. But if you have, let's imagine a board that is 1 tefach, which is the minimum width of an ohel, and that's the only piece you have there. It's not connected with anything else. And you have a piece of dead body underneath that, a kazayit of met underneath it. Only under the beam is tameh, not anywhere else. Now how about, said the Mishnah, if I have one beam here, one beam here, another beam here, another beam here. So they are corresponding beams of 1 tefach width, but they are not in the same level. The levels are completely mixed. Mebulbal, like the Gemara said in the name of Shemuel, right? Hamebulbelet. It is mixed up. Some are higher, some are lower. The Mishnah says you have a kazayit of met underneath one of them, the entire room is tameh. Why? Because halachically speaking, we are applying the concept of Chavot Rami, imagining that these are in the same level, creating a solid ceiling with all of these beams together. So Rava from there wanted to prove that the concept of Chavot Rami could only be used when the width of each one of the pieces of schach is at the very least 1 tefach. Okay? That's the proof that we had. Now the Gemara is going to challenge that and perhaps suggest that even less than 1 tefach we should be able to still say this concept of Chavot Rami. If you have a Sukkah mebulbelet, it could be even thinner pieces and you can still apply it. So says the Gemara. This Rava, the requirement of Chavot Rami being at least a tefach, was mentioned by Rav Kahana in front of Rav Ashi. Yativ Rav Kahana, 8 lines up. V'kamar lehashmata. He was saying this shmuah that he had from Rava, that we have the concept of Chavot Rami, but it has to be at least a tefach wide. Amar le Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi says, wait. He's saying to Rav Kahana, V'kol hecha delet betefach lo amrin al Chavot Rami? You want to suggest that if you don't have 1 tefach, then you don't say Chavot Rami? Says the Gemara, I have a proof not like that. V'hatanya, we learned in a Braita, and we had this Braita earlier on, so we're all familiar with this. Korah hayotzet mikotel ze v'nogad bekotel ze. V'chen shte korot achad yotzet mikotel ze v'achad yotzet mikotel ze. Ve'enan nogot zuba. Zu pachot mishelosha. Eino sarich lahavi korah acheret. What's the story? In the halachot of Eruvin, we know that when you have a cul-de-sac, when you have in Maboy, an alleyway, that's dead end. It's closed on one end. So that, Minat Torah, halachically speaking, biblical level, that whole thing is considered a shut hayachid. But when the opening of the Maboy is open to Rashut Harabim, we are very concerned that people are going to be playing or schmoozing or walking in the Maboy, and before you know it, you're entering Rashut Harabim and you forgot you're carrying stuff from Rashut Harabim. So therefore, we ban, midrabanan, any carrying in the Maboy unless you have a rabbinic fix for it, which we call eruv, right? It's shtufe mevoot. So that will be only possible if you have a lechi or a korah in the beginning, in the petach of the Maboy. Lechi is a vertical post that you put on one of the opening sides of the corner of the Maboy, of the alleyway, and korah is a beam going horizontally above the entrance, creating like a surata petach. It looks like a doorway. So that is going to serve as a reminder for people who come and go that this is a border of the Reshut HaRabim. Separate Reshut, separate domains. You cannot carry from one to another. Fine. But the Korah, the beam on the top, has requirements. One of the requirements is it should be going from one end to another end straight. So we learned in this Braita that we had before in Masechet Succah as well, that if the beam is short of less than 3 tfachim, it's okay. In other words, if you have a wall here, right, and the beam going between them is short, it's starting from one wall, from the right side or left side wall, and it's going to the other wall, but not reaching quite, ending before it reaches the other wall, but the space between the end of the beam and the wall is less than 3 tfachim. Anything less than 3 tfachim is lavud. Lavud is considered attached. So we're not bothered with that. And the same would be if you have a beam coming from the right kotel and a beam from the left kotel, and they don't quite meet in the middle, but the space in between them is less than 3 tfachim, that's also considered lavud. We assume that they're touching, and that's kasher. So that's the part of the Braita that we already saw before. Now, says the Gemara, Pachot mishlosha eno sarich lehavi korah acheret. If the space is less than 3 tfachim, you do not need to bring another korah, another beam. Shlosha, but if it is 3 or more, then you do need to bring another korah, because that's not attaching your 2 walls together. That 3 tfachim or more is considered a breakage, so you need to fix that with another korah, another beam. So says the Gemara, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, this is a new one. You ready? Rashbag, none other than the legendary Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, you know what lavud is? Not 3 tfachim, but 4 tfachim. Do you know that? There's actually a shita in Tanaim that holds lavud is 4 tfachim. We never had this before in our Masechta, so it's the first time. So says Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, even if you have 3 tfachim, still kasher. Up until 4 is considered lavud, you're good to go. And sarich lavi korah acheret, but arba, once you hit 4, that's when you need another korah. Vechen shte korot hamat'imot, and says the Braita continuing, if you have 2 korahs that they are side by side, lo bezu kedei lekabel ariach, velu bezu kedei lekabel ariach. Let me explain a little background to this. The requirement for the korah, for this beam that is serving as your doorpost, so to speak, to allow carrying inside the mavoi, is that the thickness of the korah has to be at least a tefach. It has to be thick enough to handle, to tolerate a binyan of bricks on top of it. Now, the bricks that they had in the time of the Gemara were 1.5 tfachim by 3 tfachim. So they're the size of the standard bricks that they had in time of the Gemara. They were 1.5 tfachim wide and 3 tfachim long. So in order to have a korah, to have a beam that could handle a structure of bricks that are 1.5 tfachim wide, you need the beam itself to at least be 1 tefach wide. So you have a little bit sticking from each side, that's fine. But it has to be at least a tefach wide. So says the Mishnah, you either have to have this beam that is 1 tefach wide, or you could have 2 parallel beams together, that both of them together are 1 tefach. Each one of them is less than tefach, but you put them next to each other, and now they could hold this structure of the bricks on top. That's also good. So long as you have the combination of a tefach, you're good to go. Says the Gemara, V'chen shte korot hamat'imot, 2 parallel beams that are going from one side of the alleyway to the other side, and they are parallel, lo bezu kedei lekabel ariach, ve'lo bezu kedei lekabel ariach. None of them individually could hold an ariach, a brick on top of them, because they're not a tefach wide on their own. Im mekabelot ariach lerochvo tefach, en sarich lehavi korah acheret. If both of them together could accept an ariach, could tolerate the structure of these bricks on top, then you're good to go. If not, sarich lehavi korah acheret. Then you need to bring another one. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, Im mekabelot ariach leorko shlosha tfachim en sarich lehavi korah acheret. Says Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, they could be even far apart from each other. These 2 do not have to be attached together, but they could be even standing a little far, so long as they could hold a brick on top, and it doesn't have to even be on its rochav. It doesn't have to be on the width of the brick, it could be even on the length. That means I have a beam that the head of the brick is on top of, like one end of its length is on top of it, and the other one could be 2 tfachim away from, and the other end of the brick is on top. So you end up with something like this, that the brick on its length is sitting on the 2 bricks, one end of it on the length side is on one, and the other one, and that's good enough as well, says Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. So says the Gemara, if you have that, that's the minimum that you could work with, says Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. Now, how about if the level of these two is separate? I want to have 2 different beams going across, but they're not parallel together, they are in different levels. Can that work as well? Says the Gemara. If you have one of them that is in a higher level than the other one is up, one is down. Rabbi Yossi ben Rabbi Yehuda Omer, and this is what he wants. This is what we want over here. We assume, halachically speaking, as though the top one is lowered, or that the bottom one is elevated high up, and they are paralleled together now, and they could serve as one beam, one korah together combined. Of course, we have to abide by a regular halachot of the Eruvin, which is very much like Sukkah, that the maximum height you could have is 20 amot, the minimum height you have to have is 10 tfachim. Right? So says the Gemara, you see from here, that if both of these beams are within 20 amot, then we say chavot rami, amrilan chavot rami, afal gav delit betefach. Remember, the reason that we have 2 beams here is because none of them on their own is wide 1 tefach. So each one of them is less than a tefach. That's why we need 2 beams. Otherwise, each one of them by itself would be kasher, right? So we're definitely talking about the case that they're less wide than a tefach. And one of them is here, one of them is here. They're different levels. And yet we are saying chavot rami, even though that each one of them is less than a tefach. You remember what Rava said 2 minutes ago? He said we only say chavot rami if there is a width of tefach. Now I found a source in the Mishnayot that you could have chavot rami even less than a tefach wide. That's like a bomb kasha, right? That's a good question. Rav Ashi is asking Rav Kana. Now Rav Kana was a very, very sharp individual. So Rav Kana right away turns around and says, no, that's not a raya. Why not? It sounds like a solid checkmate raya. Rav Kana says, no, because who told you that this Mishnah is talking about the concept of chavot rami? It doesn't say chavot rami. It just says that if you have 2 different levels, it's also kasher. That's all it says. It does not tell you the mechanism in which it works. You know what the mechanism is? The good old, easy, and straightforward lavud. We are talking about, and let me read the whole Braita to you, says Rav Kahana. You misread it, you read too much into it with this whole Chavot Rami business. I'm not talking about Chavot Rami at all. It's talking about the case that one beam is here, less than 3 tfachim away from each other. Then you can imagine that they're next to each other. It says 20 tfachim and 10 tfachim. No, that's not talking about one of them is all the way up there, one of them is all the way down there. It's saying that, of course, you remember that these 2, none of them could be above 20 amot. So if one of them is above 20 and one of them is just below it, then it's not good. Both of them should be less than 20 amot high, and both of them have to be above 10 tfachim high. So the lower one can never be lower than 10 tfachim, and the higher one can never be higher than 20 amot. Don't tell me that because we have lavud, one of them could be on top of 20 amot, so long as the lower one is lower than 20. You can't do that. And so you cannot say that one of them is lower than 10 tfachim, even though that the other one is higher. Both of them have to be higher than 10 tfachim and also have to be lower than 20 amot. That's all the Braita is saying, says Rav Kahana. But really, the distance between the two is less than 3, and we're considering the concept of lavud. Nobody is speaking about chabot rami. That's how Rav Kahana is going to answer it. Now, we haven't read the answer yet, but that's going to be the answer. Let's hold on to your question until I read this, and then you'll ask. Says the Gemara. This was the question that Rav Ashi brought to Rav Kahana from this shita of Rabbi Yossi ben Rabbi Yehuda, and he answers to him. He says, no, that's not a proof. Amar le taritz ve'emahachi. I will answer, and I will say like this. ובלבד שלא תהיה עליונה למעלה מ-20 אלא בתוך 20 ותחתונה סמוכה לה בפחות משלושה. The top one is lower than 20 אמה and the bottom one is right close to it, less than 3 טפחים. or בלבד שלא תהיה תחתונה למטה מ-10, that the lower one is still above the 10 טפחים minimum height, אלא למעלה מ-10 ועליונה, and of course the other one is right next to it, adjacent within 3 tfachim. That's the answer the Gemara gives. Yes?
Can lavud work vertically?
Yes, we have had this before already. The lavud could work vertically. Here, actually, lavud is working diagonally,
right,
which is also good, right? Because we know they could work vertically. We know that it could work horizontally, and now it works also diagonally. Excuse me. Says the Gemara. But says the Gemara, he is basically establishing the shita of Rava that we said before, Rav Kahana. And therefore, if anything is less than a tefach, lo amrinan chavot rami. We do not say chavot rami. So we're stuck basically with the shita of Rava before, that this concept of chavot rami, as geshmak as it is, as exciting as it may be, but you need at least a width of 1 tefach to be able to put them next to each other and lower the mechitzah that is sitting horizontally. Says the Gemara, the last part of the Mishnah that we had, the previous Mishnah that we had, was that if you have silata yoter mechamata, if you have a sukkah that gives you more shade than the sun, then it's going to be kasher. Now, what's the problem with this? If anyone could tell me what's the problem with this. Because if you remember, all the way back in Daf Bet, we said something that sounds like a problem with this line of the Mishnah that we just recently had. Remember what we had in Daf Bet? There we had the sukkah that's pasul, right? And one of the cases that the Mishnah said it's pasul is v'shechamata meruba misilata. If the sun is more than the shade, then the sukkah is pasul. Now, we're saying basically the same thing the other way around. We're saying if the shade is more than the sun, is kasher. What's the problem? The problem is, well, how about 50-50? Right? When you tell me in Mishnah in Daf Bet that if you have more sun than shade is pasul, it indicates that 50-50 is kasher. But here you tell me in this Mishnah, both of them are Mishnayot. You tell me that when you have more shade than sun is kasher, it indicates that 50-50 is not good. It's actually bad. So which one is it? 50-50 is kasher or is pasul? The indication of the two Mishnayot contradict each other. So says the Gemara. Gemara asks the obvious question. Haki hadadi psula, from our Mishnah you see that if they are 50-50 it's pasul. V'hatenan, we learned in the beginning of the Masechta in the Mishnah, be'idach pirkin, in Perek Aleph, v'shechamata meruba misilata psula, that if the sun is more than the shade, that's the only case that's pasul. 50-50 would be kasher. Haki hadadi kshera. So the indication of the two prakim, the two mishnayot, contradicts each other. So says the Gemara, lo kasha, not a problem. Kan milemala, kan milemata. We're talking about measurement of this shade versus sun on top where the schach is versus on the bottom where the floor is, right? Now, for those physics gurus, this is basically speaking about all of the concepts that you have learned. Obviously, there are formulas for shades in physics, and depends on really the source of light, and also the distance between the object and the projection. So the taller the ceiling of your sukkah is, the more difference you would make, the bigger the difference of the area that's hollow, that's open, and the open sun that you have in your sukkah on the ground. And also it depends if you're going with Newtonian physics or Niels Bohr's understanding of how light travels, or Einstein's. This is for those who are really, really sophisticated in physics. Is it the photons are traveling in a straight line, or is it like a wave line, which is Niels Bohr, also Jewish, or all of them are Nobel Peace winners of physics, or Newtonian physics is the straight line, or Einstein, which he felt that it travels in bits, and it's a very, very complicated thing to understand. But the facts were known by Chazal as well, that especially if you have a larger source of light, it's not a small source of light, so then you have shade, and also you have half shade. So without getting into too much complexities of physics and laws of shades, the bottom line is that you will have always more sun on the bottom than you have on top. So if you have a small hole on top, you will have a bigger area lit up on the bottom. That's how it works, without getting into the physics of how it works. So says the Gemara, the Mishnah in Perek Aleph, in the beginning of the Masechta, when it tells you the Shachamata Meruba Misilata is Pasul, which indicates that only if the sun is more than the shade is Pasul, but if they are equal, it would be kasher. We're talking about measuring it up there on the ceiling. But the Mishnah in our Perek that says shesilata meruba mechamata kasher, that only if the cell, the shade is more than the sun is kasher, equals will be pasul, is talking about measuring it on the ground. If you walk into a sukkah and you see the shade and the sun are exactly 50%, you're in trouble, right? Because that means that, again, if you walk into a sukkah and you see that your shade and sun are equals, it's an indication that on top are what? You have more schach, and then you're good to go. But if you walk into a sukkah and you see that your shade and sun, your open and closed areas are the same on the top, then you are in trouble. So says the Gemara, one of them is measuring the schach, one of them is measuring the shade on the ground. Lo kasha, kan minamala, kan minamata. Amar Rav Papa. Rav Papa said, this is what people say. Hainu de amri inshi. This is what people say. Kezuza mileel, if you have an opening, a size of a zuz, which is a small coin, on top in the schach, keistra miletata, is going to be as large as an istra when you measure it on the bottom. That means the opening a little bit in the schach will give you a a bigger area of sun in the bottom on the floor of your sukkah. So it says the Gemara, the last piece of our Mishnah said, if you have a schach that's so thick, like a thickness of a ceiling of a house, that you can't even see the kochavim, you can't even see the stars through it, nir'in mitocha keshera. So says the Gemara, Tanu Rabbanan, we learned even though that's so thick, the schach, that you can't see the stars, is still kasher. But if you can't even see the photons of light of the sun when you walk into it during the day, and you can't even see any rays of sun coming through the schach, that's already very thick. That's maybe too thick, and that becomes machloket Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel. Bet Shammai poslin, u Bet Hillel machshirin. Bet Shammai say that's already too thick, that's pasul, and Bet Hillel say no, there's no problem with that. Even if it's so thick that you see nothing, even the rays of sun do not make through at all, still your sukkah would be kasher, which would be the halacha. We're up to the next Mishnah, which Be'ezrat Hashem will continue to learn in the days to come. Hazak Baruch.